Wrangle. If this is your first time checking this out, this is all about live art reviews. It's all about asking questions live. It's also about looking at other things that people have done in the community, trying to figure out things that worked well, things that didn't work well, so that we can all make better art projects ourselves. So, without further ado, let me share my screen real quick and we'll get started here with the first project. All right, so this here is by Duke Gunston right here. And the first thing we have to check out is this cool little Muppet dude. So first of all, I love this idea. I don't think the whole Muppet thing gets done enough, and I think there's tons of fun things you can do with it. So from my understanding, the Houdini portion of this was the grass, it was the fur, and it was the rigging of this character. So really awesome stuff there. So to get us started, let's talk about things that are working well. I mean, first of all, I think that the lighting, the concept is awesome. I do think that the fur itself is really good too, because, you know, it has this kind of matted bedhead, kind of dirty, you know, almost diffuse looking fur on it. Because you can imagine this little Muppet guy probably lives on the ground, so he probably has a bunch of dust and dirt on him. And I definitely think that's coming through here on the shading. So that's definitely great. And the grass here too, I think it's cool. It's a little bit stylized, and I'll talk about that here in a moment. But I do like how frizzy it is. I do like the fact that, you know, it's not just straight splines that are just sticking out. We have some random bending, we have some random directions, but it's also not so random that it's just chaotic. Like there's some sense to it all, right? We have little chunks here that are generally facing the same direction. They're not just going random directions, and there's no there's no random chaos, let's say, that would make it look weird. So that's nice. One thing I think could improve this, though, looking again at this grass down here, is the idea that, you know, this is just sprouting from some rock here. It looks like rock. I can't really tell. So I think maybe having a bit more clarity on the shading on the ground here, because this to me looks like a rock, and grass wouldn't really sprout out from a rock like that. I would say that could be one thing. The other thing as well, and I'm just going to look here at the interaction. I like the interaction, by the way. I think it's really cool. Yeah, I think the interaction's cool. I almost think, though, that it doesn't react enough sometimes. Like, let me see if I can find a good spot here. Yeah, like almost like if he was taking his arm and just swiping it along the surface, you would think that it would push it over a little bit more, you know? So I think that that could maybe be exaggerated a little bit in this situation. If I'm getting picky here, this is a little bit picky. I do appreciate the fact that we have a complex fur system interacting with another fur system. That is, you know, definitely a unique challenge in itself, where it can be. But yeah, that's really cool. I think another thing too is maybe more variation in color, maybe additional plant species in here. Typically when you have grass, it's not just grass. There's like little weeds, there's little extra things in there. And even if it's a stylized scene like this, I think having a few extra miscellaneous elements would go a long way in adding more detail to the grass, especially because the grass is kind of the focus, the fact that he's, you know, pawing over it. I definitely think that since the eye goes over here, it's worth adding some variation in plant species. But yeah, overall, I love this. I mean, I think it's great. It's a lot of fun. This little dude's awesome. I love the character. As far as the rigging goes, I love the fact that we have this little anteater nose. And the fact that when he laughs, it's kind of almost like separate from the anteater nose as well. It definitely adds to that Muppet feel to it, that little puppet vibe. So yeah, that's really cool. Let's see here. This is by Patrick. I think the eyes, tongues, and gums would benefit from more substance or subsurface scattering. Yeah, that too. I would say so. That's one of those stylistic calls where I think that you could make the argument, hey, we want this to be a puppet, and so we want to make it look like it's a painted object. But I do think that having subsurface scattering, at least on the grass, could make this pop a little bit more. So that's a really good idea. All right, this next one here is by at URE95, Sunday Explorations in Houdini. Looks like this is a modeling shading sort of challenge. Really cool. We do have some fireflies down here and whatnot. That's one of the first things I noticed. And by the way, if you're ever rendering and you notice these little bright specks, these fireflies, one thing that can often cause that, because I've seen this a few times this week, one thing that can cause that is a HDR with a really, really bright sun. And so just in the future, if any of you guys have this issue of fireflies showing up and you can't get rid of them, one of my first pieces of advice is to go to your HDR, paint out the sun. So go in Photoshop or Affinity Photo, whatever, get rid of that sun, because what happens is that a sample goes to that object, it hits a reflection, and that reflection hits it just right so that it goes straight towards that bright, bright sun. And that's what gives you these really intense values right here. So just in the future, if you guys ever run into that, that's one way that you can fix that. But fireflies aside, let's talk about this a bit more. So the first thing that's catching my eye is just the presentation. It's a nice presentation. I talk about the backdrop all the time. The fact that this is not just a solid color, the fact that we actually have some composition coming from the lighting of the backdrop itself, I think is really cool. And especially if we have this gobo action down here, which I think is gobo. Could be gobo or bump, either way. Let me move my portrait aside here so you guys can see it. Yeah, so this kind of stuff right here is really cool. It just breaks up the image. Now, along those lines, when we have this interaction on the ground and there's not really a hard shadow, that looks a little bit weird and fake. I mean, there is a shadow right there, but it almost looks like it's hovering somehow. We could kind of see this happening right here as well. So I think that, you know, in looking closer here, I guess this isn't really like a hovering thing. It is just kind of a hard shadow. Maybe try softening that shadow a little bit. And then also right here, with that interaction zone, it's not that bad, but maybe, I don't know, maybe just trying to make some kind of like indentation or make it bump just a little bit more so that it shows interaction. Those interaction areas sounds like a small thing, but actually ends up being a lot. Anyway, that's kind of, again, getting picky here. So yeah, in terms of the object itself, it kind of melts on the surface. I think that's super cool. I do like these highlights right here as well. Kind of adds a little bit of glam, right? A little bit of pizzazz to it all, which is nice. But I do think it could be a little bit too glowy for my taste. That's just personal preference. But, you know, I think that maybe toning that down just a little bit would be good. I always think to myself, how can I add something in and make it so you don't notice it, but you feel it? And I think that glowing in vignettes are two things that you want to feel more than notice. And that's my personal take on it. Other people have different opinions. That is kind of an opinion thing. But I definitely think that in this case, my eye goes straight to these highlights. And I do think it slightly takes away from the I guess, recognition of the object itself. However, I do love all of this refraction going on here and all this dispersion as well. We have these cool little rainbow colors happening, which is really awesome. Also love the fact that we used a scan right here. That adds so much detail. All these little extra shadows and speckles of light. It goes a long way to adding to the perceived quality of this render. So that's really cool. Shallow depth of field is awesome. We are getting a little bit noisy around here, so be careful about that. But yeah, all in all, I think this is really cool. Nice presentation. And one thing I think everyone can take from this is when you have just an object in a scene, make sure you're thinking about this backdrop. You're making sure you're thinking about something besides the subject. Like, this isn't just a vase and a plain backdrop. This is a vase-looking thing, and there's also wood, and it's melting against that wood, and there's a backdrop, and there's these little, breakups in the backdrop. Think about everything as a whole and not just the one thing that is the subject. So that's one awesome thing to take from this. Okay, great job, URE. Much appreciated. All right, what else we have here in the comments? What are the next courses that I'm planning? So yeah, great question. I am currently in the middle of developing a brand new Houdini for the New Artist series. And specifically, it's going to be Houdini for the New Artist using Houdini 20. So right now I'm in the beta testing for that. And I'm putting together ideas on how to incorporate better workflows with Karma. I'm going to be kind of switching up my message a little bit so that as a beginner, you don't have to get Redshift right away. I want my courses to be friendly no matter what render engine you're using. In the past, I have taught both Karma and Redshift, but I find that people get really stressed out when I say go towards Redshift as a beginner. So yeah, I'll be redoing that. I'm also in the process of writing a new book, which is really cool. This new book is called the Houdini Specialization, or not the Houdini, but the CGI Specialization Guide. And this book is all about talking about different areas of expertise within the VFX, game dev, motion graphics industries. And it's a book that's there to help you understand what the different roles do, the pros and cons of those roles. I offer some advice on, what kind of people are happiest in those roles, and then action steps on how to get started. So again, this is going to tie into Houdini for the New Artist. I'm trying to bring education a little bit more broadly to the CGI community in general. And so with the book and with a redo of Houdini for the New Artist 1 and 2, that's currently what's on the docket for me. So yeah, thanks for asking there. All right, so is there anything really cool to change in how we use in Houdini 20? Not really. I mean, I can't say too much about it at the moment, but what I can say is that, the fundamentals don't change. And the fundamentals, for the most part, don't change. What has changed is workflows for Karma. Not really specific to Houdini 20, but just ever since Karma came around, that's been kind of a curveball on how you shade things, how you light things. It's just a different workflow ever since Solaris came about. So that's still the biggest change for the beginner. But for the most part, all the concepts are still the same. If you're watching Houdini for the New Artist right now, it's not like you're really missing out. I'm just trying to, I guess, polish and get rid of some of the rough edges that it currently has. That's kind of, I think, the best way of thinking about it right now. But yeah, all the concepts are still universal. It's not like it's a new version that comes out and you have to relearn everything. It's not like that. But yeah, those are great questions. All right, so, and then the other question here was by Ayob. When will the book be out? Well, I plan on releasing the book with Houdini for the New Artist. So I'm trying to hopefully have everything put together at the same time. The idea is that I want to have this whole free series include the book, include at least a good portion of that book, and then for subscribers and for people who want the audiobook, then that can be, separate from that. That could be if you're a subscriber, if you buy it on Amazon or something like that. That's kind of where I'm going with it. I'm still figuring it out a little bit, but yeah, that should be coming out fairly soon, hopefully. All right. Well, let's move on to some more art reviews, shall we? This one here is by Voxide VFX. Outworld Particles, playing with creating custom forces in VOPs. This was created without advecting the particles by any smoke, and then more about setting up curves to help guide the particles. Go right there. Okay, so yeah, let's talk about this a bit. I think this is a really cool use of particles. Um, with particles, you often see one of two things: either a turbulent noise moving particles around, or you see pyroadvection, where you make a pyro simulation, you take the velocity of that pyro simulation, and that's what moves everything around. So in this case, what the artist was saying is that we avoided turbulent noise, we avoided pyro, and instead, this is all about curves making these motions. And it really gives us this sharp looking particle effect, in my opinion. It's a lot more of a defined shape when you use these curves. So one of the first things I'll say about it is that I do love the pacing. I love how it's like a little slow-mo action, like right there. And then, it zooms in, and then we cut back out, and then it resumes the speed. I think that's a classic way of doing it. We also have a camera that's panning. So whenever you're doing your own particle effects, if you have a panning camera, really any camera movement, that actually adds a lot to the quality of the scene. It just makes it feel more like 3D, right? You're just kind of moving in this scene. And so anyway, that's something that's really good. Another thing that is good to notice is, again, this idea that we're not just thinking about the subject. We're thinking about the environment. So look at how the subject interacts with the environment. If we go back here a little bit, we have this ground particle effect that goes out, but we also have some reflections, I believe, from the water that's on the ground. Yeah, so you can kind of see it right there. And again, that kind of interaction goes a really long way to taking something from like a little side experiment to something that looks professional. So again, moral of the story is think about stuff besides your main subject. Think about the scene as a whole. And that's going to, open up a lot of interesting opportunities to play around with. Let's actually talk about the particle sim itself, maybe offer some ideas for improvement and whatnot. We have lots of particles here. I like how they blur. A lot of times, if you don't have enough motion blur, it just looks weird. I would almost argue we could probably use a little bit more. I mean, depending on whether or not you want this to feel granular or not. So there's that. The other thing I would say is let's take a look at the shading of some of this. First of all, I do love the emission right here, and I love the fact that there's not emission everywhere. There's only like certain particles that have the emission, and that adds a lot of interesting detail. That could be either through a separate particle simulation that's layered on top, or potentially it could be having one particle sim, but then, finding some kind of logic to place these emission values, along the edges or something like that. I think in this case, this is probably a separate particle sim that's layered on top. But yeah, I love how emission is added in there. It's really cool. And one thing I think could be a bit more interesting, and this, again, is just personal preference, is instead of going for a fairly diffused shader on this main tentacle here, you could try adding a little bit of a little bit more transparency. Again, I think it's cool that this feels like a solid object, but it might feel a little bit too solid. Or perhaps one idea is you could try taking another layer where you have these particles and you add in additional volumes or something like that. Almost like I know smoke wasn't used to advect this, but like what if you did have some smoke coming off of the surface here, kind of rolling back or something like that? That would be really awesome. That'd be really cool. So I do think that there is an opportunity to add in some pyro here. But yeah, really cool project. I love it. There's all kinds of great things happening here, from the camera work, from the layering of different particles. We also have this cool little electric blue that, reveals the logo. So this is really professionally done, in my opinion. And yeah, a really great project to learn from, especially if you're trying to study particles right now. So great job there, Voxide. All right, let's see here. Let's take a look at the comments again. Thanks for Vex Foundations 1. I can replicate this, mostly Vex. Will quick tips continue? Also, what is an effective method to learn chops? Yeah, so with the quick tips, I do plan on doing more, but probably next year. This year, I haven't really done quick tips. I've been focused on other things, mostly mentorships and other things that are happening there. But yeah, in the future, I do plan on doing some more. It just depends on everything else that's going on and how much time I have. So, good question there. Where are we at on time right now? Just out of curiosity. We're about 15 minutes through. Okay, cool. Let's go forward now and go to the next project here. This is by Kuvaka, Morning Quick Render. This is using Houdini Redshift and playing around with lots of glass and metal. Yeah, so this is super cool. I like this render a lot. I mean, talk about playing around with reflections and shading and just all kinds of cool stuff. I guess one of the first things I'll say is that the lighting is really cool. And I'm thinking that the lighting here is coming from some kind of HDR. I'm just guessing because whenever you have things that are reflective, it really, really benefits to have an interesting HDR because it picks up on all those colors and random shapes and patterns. And so that's definitely what's happening right here. The render is fairly noisy, I would say. Whenever you guys have a still image, you definitely want to make sure that you just crank up the render settings and let it go. Right now, we do have some noise happening here with the shallow depth of field. And so I would say turn up the quality on that. If it's a still render, just let it go. And, that's one thing. Another thing, too, is that whenever you have lots of reflections and an HDR like this, sometimes, especially because everything's bouncing around and, there's lots of complexity, sometimes that is going to take your render time way up in order to get rid of this noise. But that's just kind of part of the scene and what you're dealing with here. Now, I don't know if the modeling was done in Houdini, but if it is, then this is really cool. This is really interesting and would be a good challenge to try to replicate. I guess you would try to start with a bunch of squares, maybe bevel the edges, extrude them out randomly. That kind of seems to be the vibe here. And then I guess more specifically, you would try to randomize the selection somehow for these glass shapes versus the gold shapes. And in terms of like a good procedural modeling challenge, this would definitely fit the bill. I think that this is an interesting thing to build procedurally. But yeah, I like that. The composition's also nice. We haven't really talked much about composition today, but notice how we have diagonal lines. If you look at the borders of these shapes, they're making this X shape. And generally speaking, whenever you have compositions with diagonal motion, it adds tension, right? Diagonal motion adds tension. Crisscross, like vertical, horizontal, that adds stability. So, when you're trying to make a piece or you're trying to think about composition, what feeling do you want to get from it? Do you want more of a chaotic kind of, tension-filled composition? Or do you want a stable kind of crisscross composition? In this case, I agree. Having a diagonal lines here, I think adds a good quality to all this. If you did just go kind of crisscross, it would be kind of boring, in my opinion. So I do like these motion lines. It's really great. And my eye personally goes right here to the center, but I am a little bit annoyed by this big old block here. I almost feel like it's encroaching in on the main subject, which is right here. So in my opinion, I would try taking this down a little bit, unless that's the intent, unless you're trying to add tension there. Just because it definitely feels like it's crowding in on this little guy's space here. And like I said, maybe that's the extra tension that you want in the composition. But, in this case, I do think it feels like it's almost like pressing up against where I want to look. And that could be good or bad. Just something to recognize, I would say. So anyway, yeah, this is really cool. Love the shading, love the procedural modeling, cool project, and great job here, Kuvaka. All right. This is another question here by Kapish Patel. How to control velocity of moving cloth in vellum cloth means how to control velocity of running things cloth. Please tell me. Well, you could just use particle forces. I don't know what kind of velocity you're trying to go for, but vellum is essentially a very, very sophisticated particle sim. You can use pops like anything else. So you can add wind, you can add, turbulence, whatever. And that could give you a lot of different velocities from that. So that's what I would say. I would say look at your particle forces, try to use that with vellum somehow. And that's probably the easiest way to go about, adding in some velocity there. All right. This next one here is by Kopef Gestaltung. I think I said that right. I don't know. But this is called Rise. New audio-visual work in color. Let's check this out. Full screen. All right. Shallow depth of field. Rising fluid simulation, or it looks like it's rising. Cool cuts to different scenes. Yeah, this is a cool project. And one of the first things I was thinking about is how cool is it that with just maybe rotating your camera, you can take a fluid simulation and make it look like it's going up a surface. Or, yeah, I think that's actually what's happening here. So imagine taking a fluid simulation, it goes down, covers an object like it normally does, but all you do is take the camera, you rotate it upside down, and it looks like it's heading up on the object instead of heading down. Really cool trick. Never thought of that before. And it just goes to show also, you guys, that it's worth playing around with your cameras. It really is. And I don't know if it's done enough sometimes. But this is a great example of you can make an entire concept of a project just by rotating a camera. So that's really cool. Let's talk a bit about the simulation itself. Let's take another look here in a moment. So yeah, our first shot here is really shallow depth of field. I do like how, it's hard to tell because of the video quality here, but it doesn't look like this is a noisy render, which is nice. But you can't really tell right away what this is. And we've talked about this a couple times before, but this is another example of it, where if you start with a establishing shot that's really quick, but you don't quite know what it is yet, it adds curiosity. So at this first shot here, I don't know what I'm looking at yet, but it's interesting. I have, some curiosity because I don't know what this is, and there's moving shapes and lights, and it looks really cool. But having a fast establishing shot where you can't tell what it is and then quickly moving on to something else, it's a good strategy for adding curiosity and interest in this thing in the first place. The first few seconds of any project, I think, can benefit from figuring out how to hook people, how to add curiosity and interest in what's going on. And mystery, which is this right here, is a good way of doing so. So we have that. We begin seeing it crawl up this surface. And I do like all this tiny detail here in the surface. It looks like a coral thing, like, I don't know, something like that. Maybe a scan of some kind. But we have all this tiny detail, which, again, if it comes from a scan, if it comes from displacement, these tiny details make any project feel way more high quality. So it's good that that's being used right here. And if we're talking about the shading of this stuff, when you're shading this like reflective fluid, or really anything reflective, the shading comes down to the lighting, because think about it, you're just reflecting whatever light is around it. And so in this case, if I was playing around with the shading of the liquid, I would mostly be switching out HDRs and seeing what colors show up. In this case, because it's almost like this mercury reflective looking thing. And so that's really cool. Again, we keep a very shallow depth of field. One of the benefits of that is this fluid itself is a fairly coarse resolution when you get up really close to it. From back here, it's not so bad, right? We have these little tendrils here. It's still a little bit goopy, but it's not that bad. One of my critiques is right here when we get really close to it. It's not bad. I like the fact that we seem to be having negative divergence, creating these like little strands, these little almost like goopy things that come together. But again, it feels just a little bit coarse in my opinion. We don't have any shapes that are thinner than these big old droplets right here. I guess this would be like the biggest droplet you can have. And part of that comes down to meshing, and then part of it comes down to resolution of the simulation, and part of it comes down to the fact that you're getting this close to the fluid. So I think a few things could make this feel a little less goopy. A different meshing technique, bringing back the camera a little bit, and then also trying to maybe increase the resolution if possible. So those three things can make it feel less goopy. But, you know, I guess this can also be stylistic depending on the kind of fluid you want. But yeah, I would say the resolution works quite well up until that last part right here, where I think it could just go back a little bit and do all those things I was just mentioning. And it's hard to get rid of these goopy shapes, but it's definitely possible. And if you're going to get that close to a fluid simulation, just make sure you're really watching out for that right there, because it's very easy to lose detail if you do get too close to it. But yeah, anyway, this is really good. Great fluid simulation, great idea. Love the backdrop, the shading, the concept. It's awesome. So great job there, Kapefgestaltung. Okay, here's another question. This is by Owen. Would you choose to render this on Redshift or Karma? My personal preference is still on Redshift. I just think it's less of a hassle. I think it's faster. Karma XPU has, and let's just say XPU, or because, you know, most people want that comparable speed to Redshift. It still has some quirky things about the workflow. Once you know about the quirks, it's not a big deal. But you know, just for setting up a basic scene and just to kind of stay at this high level of artistic thought, I like just using Redshift because the workflow is a little bit more ironed out in my opinion. So yeah, that's what I'd say. You can use either though. You can get great results either way. All right. So, really good projects thus far, I have to say. Really cool stuff. This next one here is by Kuvaka. My old R&D was smoke, and my tried make a high quality simulation all sim I made on laptop. Cool. Let's view this full screen here. Yeah, this is really cool. I'm just looking at, you know, everything that's going on here. Really interesting stuff, I have to say. So this looks like a combination of particles and volumes, and a really cool one at that. Trying to think about, you know, how this was made. We have this little spherical object. It looks like that's emitting smoke. That smoke then causes an interaction to happen with the surrounding areas. And then the little objects here are controlled via advection by the velocities of the resulting pyrosim. So again, just a great project for this interaction of particles and pyro. One of the things, well, a few things caught my eye that's really cool about this is just how thick and viscous this surrounding smoke feels. You know, it just feels like this solid mass that it's pushing through. And I think the reason why it feels like that is due primarily to the shading. It's just a very, very dense smoke. And I don't think that there's anything special about the what would you say, the viscosity of it, although perhaps that's part of it. I think what's more so the case is just the fact that it's shaded in a really thick way. And that's what makes it feel, you know, like a solid object that it's cutting through, which is awesome. You know, these little glowy bits add a lot too. Adds a lot of visual interest. I mean, think about it. When we have this cutting through, look at the contrast with these glowy things and the dark areas right here. That contrast adds a lot of visual interest. Like if you were to take out these glowy bits and just have the smoke, it would still be cool. But sometimes just having a little bit of glow in there just makes whatever it is pop. And in this case, it definitely makes it pop, and it makes you see the advection of the particles much more than if it was just these little dark chunks right here. Like, we could see that there's some dark chunks and they're advecting along, but what makes us really see it better is these little glowy bits. And so it adds motion on top of contrast as well. And anyway, this is just a really cool idea. Love it. Yeah, in terms of improvements, also, I want to say the lighting is really cool. I think we have some shadows being cast from the top down. And then these little black bits here are casting shadows onto the smoke. So I think that's what's happening. And that's a really creative usage of lighting because we're breaking up this solid smoke shape with these shadows. One thing I would say could improve this or take it up a notch is if you were to add more variation of color throughout this whole body of smoke. Like, you can still have it be a blue, but having areas that are a little bit darker, a little bit lighter, maybe even varying a tad bit in density, just more variation in general, even if it's really subtle, I think would add even more detail on top of the shadows that are being cast down onto it. So yeah, I think that's one area of improvement I think could, you know, take it up a notch. But I mean, yeah, again, great idea, great simulation. Love the mixing of colors as well. Cool stuff. Great job there, Kuvaka. I like it. All right, asking a question here. Tried to finish the free tutorial on CG Forge, but for some reason I can't render it. I use the apprentice license. Thanks for your help. What you do is great. Yeah, so Agilos, feel free to send me an email, and I can help you probably a little bit more specifically there and just break down what you've tried so far and what you're trying to do. So what I'll say is that if you're trying to use apprentice, you'll be using Karma because Redshift doesn't come with apprentice. And so that's kind of where people have been finding a wall with my intro series, and that's what I'm trying to fix in the future. But yeah, if you're just using Karma, you can still do it. What I would say is just keep in mind that XPU wants to use Material X shaders, and Karma CPU wants to, you know, use whatever shader you throw at it. So it could use Material X, it can use the principled shader. It's good with whatever. So if you're trying to use XPU, which I think it sounds like you might be, a lot of people have been getting tripped up on the fact that they need to use Material X for those shaders. So just watch out for that. And beyond that, I'll have to kind of know more specifically what you're running into to help you out. So yeah, send me an email, tyler@cgforge.com, and I'll be happy to help you out. All right, so we have a few more things to talk about here. Ian Smith has been working really hard at putting the finishing touches to Project Pegasus. If you guys haven't heard, Project Pegasus is a really cool project that Side Effects is doing right now. If you say Side Effects Project Pegasus, this is what I'm talking about. Well, actually, it looks like their website is down. But yeah, Side Effects is doing Project Pegasus. It's a big environment scene, and along the way that they're trying to make courses and tutorials and everything you need to know in order to how to make that and then put it into Unreal Engine. So definitely something that I've been keeping a side eye on because it looks really cool. But yeah, I just want to let you guys know about that if you haven't heard about it yet. Yeah, so far, like everything here, I believe, is made from scratch. And it starts off with some terrains. They start populating things, instancing things, adding lighting, cloud systems, the whole nine. And I think this is going to be a really cool series to learn from. All right, moving on. This is by Max Schweiger. Last R&D I created with MVSM on Lululemon. And so this looks like a project that was for Lululemon. We have some leggings, we have Vellum, Houdini, side effects, simulation stuff. Let's check it out. All right, so first impression is a really cool concept. I mean, yeah, having this grow from cloth is interesting. Let's see here. I do like how there's a variety of species. I love the growing effects. Growing effects is really cool. If you guys wanted to do something like this, I think it would be fairly simple to do. Basically, everything you see here, except maybe for this first system, like all these instances can just be done with copy to points. And then all you do is animate a p-scale from 0 on up to 1, and then that can make things grow like you see right here. So that's what looks like is happening right there. Also, the lighting is cool because, you know, we get to see around this shape. Whenever you have a round object, you want to make sure that the form is being captured. You don't want it looking flat. You want it looking round. So that means usually having some shadow that bends across the object. So we kind of see that right here. But if you had shadow that was just kind of, or light that was just kind of like feathering around it, I personally use that as my starting ground. Like, let me get a light, let me get that light bending around it if I can, and then that's going to really emphasize the shape. So in addition to that, we have, it looks like maybe a key over here, especially on the bottom. That's good too for defining a silhouette. And I would take this key light, this whole area, let's just say right here, and I would take that and wrap it around just a bit more to get more of the shadow, right? We do have it wrapping around right here, but if you can, make it wrap around more, go around the leg a little bit so that that shadow maybe goes from the center on out. So just a little bit further with that shadow. And again, the whole goal here is to emphasize the form. So if you guys want to make lights wrap around things, a very easy way of doing that is to create a directional light and then turning up the angle. So when you turn up the angle, it kind of, how do I say, it makes the light wrap around it, basically. It softens the shadows. And if you really went crazy with it, you can wrap around this leg pretty good in the process. Anyway, that's some lighting bits here. What are some things that can improve this though? One thing I would say is breaking up this leading edge here. And so what you can do is if you're just using p-scale, let's say, for these instances, is you can take p-scale and multiply it by some kind of noise, and then perhaps that multiplier gets reduced as the control object goes over it. So for instance, you have a noise, you set noise on that p-scale, and then when we have the reveal happening here, it's not just a reveal, there's also another multiplier on P scale that randomly shifts from a noise to a solid color or a solid value of 1. And what that does is it breaks up this leading edge so that it's not a straight line. Sometimes you want that straight line, but in this case, I think even just a little bit of breakup will go a long way. And yeah, that'll add some more variety. The other thing that will do is it will make these different objects stop growing at different times. So by having a noise on that leading edge, it not only breaks up the edge, but it prevents, let's say, these guys from reaching their max height all at the same time. And it just adds a lot of organic movement to the whole thing as well. So that's one thing I would say could improve it a little bit. But yeah, cool concept. I like it. Also some camera work. Pan around that leg a little bit. It makes everything feel more 3D. I think that would also do quite well here. But like the shading, like the lighting, cool concept. Great job, Max. All right. This is another question. I've been having a hard time meshing a splash fluid. The little drops are appearing and disappearing. Any tips? Well, if you have some drops that are appearing and disappearing, it looks like maybe the smoothing on your meshing, it could be getting rid of certain things. Like sometimes if you add too much smoothing or blurring, you get a droplet and then it just whoop, disappears because they got smoothed into nothingness. And so I would double check that. I also personally like taking a meshing technique that uses the volume directly from the flip solver and then just meshes things from there using just VDB operations. I like that best because the more stuff you do with the information coming from the solver, the more smoothing, the more filters, the more this and that, the harder it is to control what's going on. And a lot of times it comes at the cost of detail as well, where again, you lose those small details because you're smoothing too much. So I would think of it like this. We want to make sure that we take the raw data and process it as little as possible to try to maintain everything as much as possible. If we're trying to go for a highly detailed, very splashy kind of look that doesn't lose anything. Depending on the fluid simulation, you might want to have all those different filters and smoothing things happening, but too much of it can cause the issue that you're talking about here. So that's what I would do. I would just take the information and try to see if there's a way to process that as little as possible. All right. So I think we have time for maybe one more here. Maybe two more. Here we go. Yeah, so this one here is by Sergi. The interweaving and movement of lines as a metaphor for the neurons that connect or that form connections and shape our thoughts and memories. All right, I might have to refresh the page here. Internet might be stalling out here. Let's try it. Oh, there it goes. I think because I'm streaming, maybe the browser's having a hard time or something like that. Well, let's see here. Or it could be Twitter. Who knows? Yeah, I think let's actually just call it that. We've done a lot of art reviews. We've done a lot of questions and back and forth for the day. And it looks like my internet's stalling out anyway, so I think that might be my cue. Thank you all for watching so much. Again, I'm looking forward to releasing that book, hopefully improving Houdini for the new artist to make it a smoother experience for everyone. I don't think it's bad as it is, but I think it just could be a lot better. And so that's what I'm doing. And in the meantime, if there's any projects you want me to review for next month, I do this about once a month. Send me an email, tyler@cgforge.com. And again, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a great day.